Then, when it was just light with the sun, they all went to the priest. They said to him, "Father, put on your gown and your ruff, and come to bury these men, Anders Bjornsen and Hans Thorbjorn." You understand that they were sure these men were dead, so they went to the wood. My grandfather never forgot this. He said they were all like so many dead men themselves. The priest, too, he was in a white fear. He said when they came to him, "I heard one cry in the night, and I heard one laugh afterwards. If I cannot forget that, I shall not be able to sleep again." May God keep you safe, dear listeners. Tonight, on Roll of a Tangent, we shall discuss another R.James story called Count Magnus. Set in the 18th century, the story depicts a traveling man with no home of his own that decides to make a living on travelogs. Mr. Wraxall, a curious sort that never lets an opportunity go, makes his way towards Sweden to woo and wow his readership back in England. What he discovers, however, quickly leads to a series of unfortunate and harrowing events. M.R. James's writing style is precise, well-structured, and poignant. This tale showcases his craftsmanship and wordsmithing, allowing the reader to fully immerse themselves in the life of a lonely traveler in a distant land. That's Count Magnus for you. Before I say anything regarding the tale, I think I will let everyone else go because I have quite a few things to say, but I wish to keep them hidden for the moment. Robert Gibson, why don't we start with you? You were the one who suggested Count Magnus, were you not?
Yes, slightly reluctantly because when I first read it, I found it a bit too good. I don't often, very, very rarely get scared by horror stories or ghost stories, whatever. Very rarely indeed, because something in me prevents true fear from getting a foothold. I suppose there's some inner sense of, this is just make believe. But for some reason, this story got underneath my defenses. When I read it the second time to prepare for the podcast, I was all right. I managed to do it without getting too scared, but I will never forget the first impression it left on me. And it's interesting, to me, it's interesting to figure out why. And I think partly, for some reason, it's partly the unspeakably gruesome familiar which Count Magnus brings back from his black pilgrimage to Chorazin, and the idea of the poor chap in the wood who's seen it and who, for the rest of the short rest of his life, pushes something away. He can't stop doing that. But also, there's the idea that through no great fault of your own, except for a rather overweening sense of curiosity, you can summon up something unspeakable fairly innocently, as this Mr. Wraxall does. He simply says words to the effect of, "Oh, I wish I could meet this Count Magnus," just out of curiosity. And every time he says something like that, one of the clasps of the sarcophagus breaks off. And the third time, the lid starts to open, and like anyone would do, he scarpers. That, to me, that is the idea of the voluntarily letting yourself in for that is there's something horrendous about it. Don't know what you chaps have to say about that. I'm being psychological here, trying to figure out why it scared me so much.
Hmm. Anthony, maybe you want to continue on this train of thought,
Yeah,
see what you
I
felt
don't.
about the story.
I guess I wasn't. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm the wrong person to ask about why you would be scared by the story. I found it very quaint, and maybe it's the time of year because, and I've always been curious about a line from a song before, the Christmas time season. There'll be scary ghost stories from the, it always struck me as interesting that Christmas time, maybe it's British, but it's a British trope. But, and Robert, maybe you can help explain this to me. Is it very British to read ghost stories during the holidays? Because I've always pondered over that. And I thought
think
it was like, maybe was it just a convenient rhyme for that story? Because I don't know. So circling back to, maybe it's the time of year, but I was like, oh, it's quaint. And even with someone's face being ripped off, maybe that's just my desensitization of where I am with horror, because I'm just like, oh, well, I know someone gets his face ripped off. They find a corpse with his face gone, right? But that didn't phase me for some reason. I don't know. So, and it was almost like, the Count Magnus creeping around was it Santa Claus and the Krampus wandering around? I don't know, with his strange familiar. It's so I guess I was not terrified by the story. I kind of was. It was endearing to me. So I don't know what that says about me. Uh, I don't. The story was well written. It left me with a lot of questions in a good way. What was this black pilgrimage? Where did they go? Where did Magnus go? Who is this strange figure that I guess follows his revenant around, or whatever that he is? If he's coming back from the grave and he was dangerous enough to be, locked into his sarcophagus. It, I don't know. It was just, that was strange. So I like those unanswered questions. I like that those things were left unanswered. I thought it was well written, but I wasn't terrified by it. And as I was talking to Robert before the show, this is my first R.James story. Sort of, I heard of him and people telling me, you have to read R.James. He created the modern ghost story. There's some such claims people have said. I've always heard that this person or that person created the modern ghost story. I'm like, okay, was it R.James? Was it this other author? I think sometimes people put forward, oh, it wasn't R.James. It was, some other writer. I don't know, but I can't bring to mind what other writers people have said in the past to me to make that claim. But so this is my first time reading through one of his stories completely rather than a fragmentary reading. And I liked it. But I don't know. I have to say it was more quaint to me than frightening, but your mileage may vary. Nikki, XJ. XJ, I guess, is up next. Nikki wants to go
Yeah,
last.
sure.
I'm also eating a cookie. Sorry, go on.
I shall ban cookie eating from the podcast in the future because it makes me hungry. And one.
I'm sorry.
No, just kidding. I did have some thoughts about Count Magnus, and then hearing Robert's feelings on the matter, I started thinking about pornography. And the reason for that is, it is said that the one who watches pornography a little bit too much becomes desensitized to matters of that sort, shall we say. And and I wonder if it isn't the same for me and perhaps Anthony as well, because especially since I come from a visual background, the visual depiction of the black thing that Count Magnus brought back from his black pilgrimage is not scary at all. Obviously, I have seen as a visual artist and had to deal with concepts and artistic renditions of fearsome creatures all the time, and a short thing cloaked in black is not, I should be careful of my words here, they are not horrifying in a horror story sort of way. I mean, obviously, if the thing is breaking through trees and bounding after me, I would be absolutely frightened out of my wits, but that would be the same kind of fear I would have if a bear was chasing me. But it's not of the supernatural sort. And as for the claps on the sarcophagus breaking, it probably leads to a nice segue. It's probably a nice segue into what I originally intended to say. Perhaps I don't know what the feeling of a reader back when this was first published, how they would have felt about it, right? I don't know, but I'll tell you one thing: the beginning of Count Magnus reads a little bit like H.P. Lovecraft. You know, I am relating this story because I found this piece of paper in something that just sounds like out of his New England professor beginning a tale of eldritch horror. And then the later part, I don't know, it just reminds me a lot of Count Dracula actually. So it feels like very familiar ground that had been tread upon many times. And even the collapse breaking off the sarcophagus is like, I expect to see this in I don't know, Saw, and then I'll be like, man, that guy's in for it. You know, it's the kind of things that is a shared language of storytelling. You put certain hints in, and then you know this guy's about to be offed. You know, for the genre. And so I do wonder, because just like Anthony, I don't feel frightened at all by the story. It is well written, well crafted, and I certainly am intrigued about what actually is even the Black Pilgrimage. Like, what is it even? And
Can I just
yeah,
interrupt here? It's easy to find out about the Black Pilgrimage. You just pick up your annotated edition of R. James,
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
and you look
That
at
all of
the-
us currently have.
and it says Black Pilgrimage to Chorazin may have been MRJ's invention, but it has subsequently been taken up by a number of writers and occultists. And the quotation is from the Bible, and then you pick up your Bible,
which
and
some
you
of us
read-
would have.
You read from St. Matthew's Gospel, which I actually read from when our sound check. Then he began to upbraid the cities wherein most of his mighty works were done, because they repented not. Woe unto thee, Chorazin. And from that slight indication, R. James has woven the idea of this Black Pilgrimage, if it really was his idea, unless he picked it up from somewhere.
I'm perfectly happy knowing all of that background information. Actually, thank you very much, Robert. It's it would be kind of like a law that R. James has started to weave into his story, perhaps. Yeah, I like that idea.
Yeah, I'm sure he did all sorts of terrible things. Count Magnus did on his Black Pilgrimage, and
Yeah.
wound up finding a nice friend. I'm sure it was some sort of horrible event where he found immortality
I
in
would
some
be
evil way.
interested in reading that story, to be quite honest. Yeah.
Right? Exactly. Exactly. Someone
Yeah.
needs to do
Well,
like
My
needs
grandfather
to get
used to
on that.
say, if you want to read it but it doesn't exist,
You
write
write
it.
it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Challenge.
That sounds like a challenge. All right. All right. We shall keep that in the back of our minds. Now, here's the thing though. I guess I don't regret spending time reading the story. I am not frightened by it. There are several things that I'm intrigued by that is written in the story. Chief amongst them, the Black Pilgrimage, which Robert had kindly illuminated for us. And yeah, it's not a bad story, I have to say. First of all, not a bad story. All right, over to you, Nikki.
All right. So, few podcasts ago, I said something along the lines of like, this feels like I'm disappointing my father, and today I I feel like I'm doing the same thing here, where I wish I liked the story much more than I did. The first 10 minutes of me reading of it, I was intrigued, I was excited, I was gripped by the tale, and then it just lost me. And I think it lost me because I'll describe it thusly. Imagine you are in love with a girl. It's, let's say, high school or something like that, and every time you come over towards her, she's kind of giving you signals of affection and sympathy and some of the stuff. But every time you actually come over and ask her if she wants to go to the movies or to the park, or so, she laughs it off and doesn't give you an answer that is satisfactory. And at some point, if you have enough self-esteem, you just say, enough of this shit. I'm not coming to her anymore. I'm going to find somebody who's actually not going to mess around with me. This is how I felt about this story. This story messed around with me the entire time and then left me on red. Like, what the hell was that about? Like, I don't think there was enough of the horror in this horror story. I do realize, by the way, that the whole point of the tale, the way it was written, is that relationship that I described, with this high school girl or high school boy, if you're of the different gender. It is about the tease. It is about the titillation. It is about you yourself creating the horror within your mind. And that is why it works so well on Robert, because he has imagined 1,000 things worse in his head about Count Magnus than what is written in the story. Because for him, this trick worked. This trick created the feeling, the desire to imagine something horrible. Excuse me. But for me, that trick just didn't work. Perhaps some might say I read the story wrong. But I have a different explanation. I believe that, at least for me, because horror is such a thing. It is something that you can get desensitized to, just like XJ and Anthony said. It is something that's very peculiar and particular, just like humor, right? But at least for me and for people who are like me, the story doesn't have enough of substance to begin scaring me into imagining the horror. I feel like it's just on the clasp of having something there to truly terrify me and send my imagination into overdrive, but it fell short. And that's, I feel like, is even more devastating than if I just said, oh, I didn't care much at all for this story, it was boring. It's like it almost got me, but it didn't. And that's really disappointing. It's I do not know how else to describe it besides this unrequited love, right? It's just like, we're about to have something, and then you get nothing. That's kind of the level of disappointment I felt with Count Magnus, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the first thing that pops into my head is comparing it to other stories that stat from the elder days, maybe not as far back as this story was written, but comparing it to something that was one of my favorite stories, and maybe it's not a ghost story, but it builds up the dread, is Pickman's Model. It was one of my favorite horror stories in general, I think. And it was just like, you're building up this tension and you kind of know how the story is going to come to fruition at the end, but it's like, it's just this building and the atmosphere that is built. This story, I honestly pictured a bunch of kids sitting around again with like the scary ghost stories and tales of the glory of Christmases long, long ago. It's the most wonderful time of the year. It's just like, I can see a bunch of kids at Christmas time sitting around and their grandfather is like, oh, like telling this story. And they're like, ooh, the locks are popping off one by one on the sarcophagus. It's a scary monster. That's kind of what it was. So that's why I feel like it was like, maybe this story is quaint. It's very quaint. It's like, ooh, ghost story around the fire, with Christmas time with Grandpa. And I'm just like, so it was more quaint than frightening. And it was just like, and you have to be maybe a little kid, or a kid at heart, like Robert, who's not jaded, maybe like the rest of us, who enjoys these stories maybe much better than we do. And maybe
Yeah,
he's all the better for it.
I really wonder if it's a case of a more modern readership
Yeah.
might feel differently about the story than perhaps a person who isn't so steeped into pop culture. Really, like
Yes. From definitely from
I
a
really do
different
think
time.
so. I really do think so because like I don't know. I don't know precisely what is the chronography of the publication of this story, like where it sits in between H.P. Lovecraft and then Bram Stoker. Uh,
Well, I think it's earlier than both. And Robert's got the annotated,
yeah.
the
So
annotated book.
Written,
Maybe.
written
if that
1901,
sorry
written 1901 or
What's that, Robert?
1902. Hmm.
1901.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
That would be after I assume.
After
Yeah.
Stoker, after Dracula,
Yeah.
right?
A few years.
Okay, I thought it was earlier, but not long after Dracula was published, but and before, definitely a few decades before.
Well, yeah, but I wonder if back in 1901, when people were reading it for the first time and people were being introduced to the idea of Gothic horror, because Gothic horror didn't really come about until when was it? I don't
Well,
remember the
Edgar
date.
Allan Poe, right?
Uh,
Well, before that, maybe.
much before, much before. I think
Yes,
I
yeah,
did
yeah,
a
yeah.
I did a bit of search for Gothic horror on a previous episode. Daptris,
Yeah,
I
like
think.
Castle of Otranto, right? I don't know when.
Yeah,
I forget when that was published. That
yeah.
was like
That was ages
early
ago.
1800s, or
Yeah,
yeah,
1780 something, I think.
yeah.
yeah,
Quite a while
late,
back. Quite a while back. But
yeah,
publications back then were not as prolific as the modern era. So I can definitely imagine a proper English person of those days sitting down and then reading and then getting deliciously terrified um, by this story. It has
yeah,
perhaps became a little blunted by the time it reaches us. The more, shall we say, cynical generation. Yeah, I think.
for sure.
I think it is. I seriously wonder if it isn't an issue of the times. Like it had became outdated.
Well,
I think that definitely plays a part in it. Go ahead, Robert.
as far as my reactions are concerned, I think you need to bear in mind that I've read all these stories,
Mhm.
and Count Magnus is the only one that had that effect on me. So it's not
Mm.
just a general thing of either my time or R. James's time. It's something particular about this story. And I've
Mm.
read R. James's stories again and again and again. And
Can you recall which moment in particular sent shivers down your spine?
no, I can't. Although I can maybe the earliest part of the story is the bit in the wood where uh, it's recounted that there's this chap making this pushing away motion. That did get to me, I must admit. But I think it's very interesting what Nikki said about the comparison with falling in love, because I thought of that in the sense of I think that there is such a thing as falling into fear as well as falling into love, and that it's equally chancy. It's a matter of chancy triggers. You might meet a girl under one circumstances and you think she's great, and you might happen to see her in some other situation and you're not particularly impressed. It's all unless you believe that these things are destined, and I'm not sure that that's true. Uh, you need to bear in mind the possibility that it is a matter of chance, a matter of chance and fluctuating mood that determines these things?
It sounds like there is something inside Count Magnus itself that stokes your particular sense of fear, perhaps. Kind of like maybe what the King in Yellow means to me versus the panel. Because they're kind of just a little bit off, but not quite. It's the kind of thing that creeps me out the most, but perhaps not to Nikki or Robert. And Anthony,
No, I agree with you about the King in Yellow, certainly. I think we're of one mind on that one.
And I think out of all the horror stories that we did, perhaps I Have No Mouth But I Must Scream was better received in the horror sense by Nikki than anything else we had done. So correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps it has something to do with all of our little individual quirks. This is exactly like you say, Robert. Love is a subjective thing, I suppose.
As is fear. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Falling into fear. I have to use that somehow, or you refer to that again. Yeah, falling into fear. It's something you don't think about. You feel it. Yeah, but you can. Yes, the best kind of love, I guess, maybe is also the best kind of fear. Is the same as you fall into them unexpectedly. The best kind of
think
love or fear is unexpected.
if we were to go through all of media, the thing that scared me the most in my life is a movie called Hostel. It's about a bunch of teenagers and young adults going to a different country and staying at a hostel, and the people who run the hostel are actually horrible murderers, and they start doing terrible things to these people. And I think the reason it scared me so much, referring back to this falling into fear, is because I could imagine that. I've been to other countries. I've traveled with friends in that age, and I've seen strange things happening there. So it just invoked something in me, memories that never existed, so to speak. Like my mind rewrote some of the things that I remembered seeing or hearing during my time in a hostel, just thinking like, oh man, what if this type of stuff was happening in that hostel at the same time that I was there? Or what if I was like a hair away from being a victim of something very similar, and it really truly terrified me. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream terrified me the most because I think it's the same thing. It's like I can imagine something becoming so powerful and so beyond us that it could trap us within this endless horror, right? It's much harder for me to connect with the travelogue maker in Count Magnus, because I've never done those things, and I guess I don't feel as attached to his story. Maybe that's for another reason.
Maybe we've just all read too much Lovecraft. Again, it struck me as academics encountering the unknown again. I'm like, maybe I'm also getting a little.
It does have that quality. I will agree with you, Anthony. Yeah, it does have that.
I mean, yeah.
But it would you'd more have to say like, we're getting tired of these pastiches by H.P. Lovecraft that he was doing of Count Magnus in that case.
But
because Count Magnus came before.
European man, like Jonathan Harker, writing a travel log, like writing in his journal, like, oh, here we go, like he's going to encounter something spooky, I don't know. I have to say
that the idea is ingenious, because somebody who's doing a travel log, it's kind of their job to find out stuff. It's their job to dig a little bit deeper so that it's more interesting to read the travel log. So, if more was done with that concept, he's like, well, the readership is gonna go crazy over these details, and he starts doing something erratic, and then we realize that maybe this eagerness of his to find out information is no longer about the travelogue. Maybe he's starting to be possessed by the evils of these lands or something like that.
I'm
But
gonna. I forgot one point, and I think I'm gonna
Mm.
bring it up. And that is the travelogue thing. You know, it really. I think another reason why I feel like perhaps desensitized to Count Magnus is because this travelogue thing to a small part of a place, and then there's something strange about that place. The Japanese do it much better. They have it is an entire genre of horror stories in Japan, mostly through their manga and a little bit of anime, where they have quaint little villages with that is still somewhere in Japan, modern day Japan, with this history of some diabolical deeds that some of their ancestors had done, and then there's just like some horrible thing that just kept being passed down, and then this bunch of school kids go to that village,
Yeah.
and then uh, the most depraved things just happen. It's like a genre unto its own in Japan, and I gotta say they are much more imaginative than Count Magnus is. But again, I have to say it could be a because stories evolve over time as well, and they improve over time. So it could be a case of um, early adopter syndrome for R.James in this case. He was there first before the Japanese, and then, yeah.
Yeah, so it was more reading this for me was more of an exercise of like you're saying, like you're seeing the beginnings of the genre, and you're seeing how the originators did it, and M.R. James, then I think it's Henry James, was also like the turn of the screw, right? Was Henry James, I think. Or am I incorrect? I don't know off the top of my head. Anyway, but it was like those stories were sort of at the beginning of the genre's creation. They created the genre, and then it's like, yeah, now it's so varied and changed, and based on culture and experience, and yeah, so it's but so it's I was trying to read it and appreciate it, but it was still like that just made it even more quaint. Like, oh, this is what people used to think was scary. It's yeah.
Well, I guess we have all given our opinions on the story. Maybe we can. How would you make this story more terrifying for you, Nikki?
I mean, first of all, the setup of the reveal at the beginning, right, where he says like, "I'll tell you at the end where I got this stuff," comes to nothing. Like absolutely nothing. Who cares where you found it? At the end, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't. The you have to fix this revelation in some way, shape, or form, because right now it's like, oh yeah, and then I found it in a corridor, basically. Like who cares where you found it? The information doesn't add anything to the story. So making it part of the setup and then doing nothing with it—that's the first cardinal sin to me that the story commits. Um, that has to be fixed. So I guess my advice to M.R. James, who's I'm sure intently listening to this, would be make it connected to Count Magnus somehow. This place that this guy has found these papers, right? Or at the very least, make the place itself scary. Like I found these fledglings um, within the the ashes of the fireplace, the house of which that I bought, that belonged to this man, for they did not burn and could not be burned. At least something like that. I mean, that's a cheap thrill, but it's better than what we got in the story. Second of all, I'd have Count Magnus on screen, or at least something that would grant more for imagination to grasp at. Because at this very moment, the thing that I feel is missing the most in Count Magnus is that tiny sliver of substance that would finish the effect and really make you feel like, oh, something scary is happening, right? I guess the ignition mechanism is missing from this weapon. Let's put it like that. And it's not firing in all cylinders because of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just didn't. If I would to do something different, it would just to ratchet up the tension a little more. To start with, more direct experience of the implied narrator or the narrator. Where it was seeing shadows moving, or just kind of like going to someplace and seeing things out of the corner of your eye, or hearing stories from scared local villagers and seeing the terror that just more foreshadowing. It seemed like it was lacking in buildup. Like it just seemed like it needed more, just everything seemed normal, 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 normal. And then, oh, this is scary. Like it was, you have to start with the normal and then start twisting and perverting the normal around you and unexpected things, and getting foreshadowing of darker things to come versus okay, well, you have this guy who's out in the woods and he's no, what's he reacting to? And then it's okay, the padlocks on you don't usually see padlocks on a sarcophagus. Okay, that's creepy. But there wasn't enough of that. There wasn't enough foreshadowing. It would just seem very pastoral, very oh, nice. It's nice scenery. It's you kind of still want to go there. It's make me kind of want to go there in the beginning, but then start making things creepy. And then I'm wait a minute, I'm starting to change my mind. And by the end of the story, you're nope, never going to go to this place. This guy should have never gone there. I don't know. It just seemed like the payoff, like you're saying, Nikki, was not there. And it was just not enough. Maybe just because it wasn't foreshadowed enough, or, it didn't pervert reality as you go along. I mean, you were talking about King in Yellow earlier, the repair of reputations. It was even started off with it was alternate reality where it's it's the early 1900s or whatever, but they've created suicide chambers, and it was and you really didn't talk about it. They didn't fixate on that. They just introduced that as a story point, and they're whoa, this is weird, creepy. What? How come you're not explaining that? And then you just kind of go on, and move on from there. So it's yeah, the foreshadowing and the impending doom wasn't built up, wasn't created in the beginning or throughout steadily enough.
If I were to venture a suggestion, and in keeping with the kind of, well, I don't know if it's meant to be psychological horror type story where it teases the mind rather than reveal to you what exactly it is. But if that is the case, and if I was the one who had written something like this and I wanted to ramp out the fear but not delve into body horror type of stuff, then my emphasis would I would probably put a little bit more effort into the last bit where Wraxall was giving very fragmented reports of two black guys staring at him all the time. He keeps bumping into two gentlemen in black. Now that would be the part where I really play up, and I would probably make the two gentlemen in black appear in the most eerie way possible, and quite possibly it recounts another story of R.James actually. wasn't it? Was it r.james actually? That was
Which
a
one?
no wait. Yes, cast the runes.
Hmm. Mhm.
The cast the runes. The casting of the runes. The guy was actually had several visitation from the evil professor, which culminated in a showdown in the train. Was that the one?
Yep.
Yep, yep.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
James.
yeah. So that was that. Perhaps this was a prototype story actually for that one. I don't know.
Hmm.
Yeah. I felt like if that section was played up, it would have been much better, much better. Yeah. If if he wants to steer away from body horror type of stories. Yeah. Well, what about you, Robert? Anything that you think would make the story scarier?
I don't know about scarier, but I've been wondering what practical advice one could give to somebody in Wraxall's position as he's on his way home. And I think that it would probably be not much good getting help from, say, the police or whatever. But I don't know. He didn't seem to try, and I think that was an example of something extra eerie in the story, that he was sort of demoralized, shall we say, and not able to help himself. He should have stayed in crowds as much as possible, and if necessary, gone and lodged in a dormitory with lots of other people. He should not have gone alone. As for who might have helped him, if the police were not inclined, he should have. Well, it would have been better if he'd been someone else, actually. If he'd been Solomon Kane, I think that's the only sort of person who could have coped with this situation. Judging from Skulls in the Stars, Solomon Kane probably would have simply confronted these beings.
Yeah, he'd wrangle it to death with his bare hands because he's
Yeah,
a damn Puritan.
well,
Yeah.
exactly. That's my advice. Don't be Mr. Wraxall, be Solomon Kane. Um, as far as
I'll follow that advice any day of the week.
yeah, but as far as
Excuse me.
some of the criticisms that you people have made of the story, I think you've got to bear in mind
You
it's a very short story. It amazed me, actually. The second time I read it, it's only 12 pages long. And that sort of story, you can't do certain sorts of build up that you can do in a much longer story.
Hmm.
Now, you might say, well, it should have been longer in order to fulfill the potential of the theme that it was centered around. But I don't know. I disagree. I think there's a room in the literature for very, very short stories of this kind. And by the way, one slightly unrelated point: Count Magnus was a real person, Magnus de la Gardie. I don't know anything about him, but judging from this story, probably wasn't a very nice person. Anyway, his
Hmm.
dates 1622 to 1686, I believe, according
at
to
the very least, James didn't like him.
no.
By his depiction.
Well, I mean, Dracula was based on a real person too.
Yeah, you mean Vlad the Impaler? Yeah.
Supposedly, Dracula was based on that guy. Yeah.
Mm.
Well,
Or at least a mythologized version of him.
yeah.
But
Well, you know what though, Robert? Perhaps casting the runes was the longer version of Count Magnus.
Well, let's see which was written first. I'll just look in here. Casting the runes. Where are we? Anyway, won't take me long. I'll just look at the contents. Casting the runes, page 145. So, explanatory notes. Casting the runes, first published in. Oh, it doesn't give a date. First published in MGS.
Let me have a look.
Yeah.
Casting the runes, publishing date. And 1911.
Right.
So, okay.
Years afterwards.
So yeah, perhaps Casting the Runes was the successor to MRJ to Count Magnus, and well, it's absolutely permissible for an author to improve on his formula. I firmly believe. Yeah.
I mean, if a music artist gets to remix their songs, why
yeah,
not?
why not, right? Yeah,
Why not a
absolutely.
book artist?
So if that's the case, then as a prototype, if it is a prototype, I think well, Count Magnus carries itself well enough. And if it indeed did give birth to Casting the Runes, then I say, well done, well done.
Very different motivation, though. The Carswell in Casting the Runes is revenging himself for nasty reviews of his work, whereas Count Magnus is not revenging himself for anything. He's just being nasty for the sake of it.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean,
Takes all sorts,
Which,
I know.
yeah, which isn't a great motivation. I don't know. I'm just mean. I'm like versus revenge versus I'm just a mean guy is not the best motivation or the scariest motivation. I don't know.
yeah, I mean, Casting the Runes was a pretty good story. I think it was quite excellent. I remember.
I have to read it. I have to read. I haven't read that, so I'll
Well,
take your word for
Yeah,
it. I'm gonna read it.
we did a whole podcast on it, and
I
had-
slammed the movie. Loved the story.
yeah, there's a
Slammed the
movie that's Night of the Demon, or what's the movie
Yes,
called?
Night of the Demon,
Night of the
yeah.
Demon. Yeah, it's a very loose adaptation of casting. I mean, and by very loose, I mean very loose.
Very loose.
Adaptation.
Yeah, I slammed the movie.
I thought the movie was great, like the first 5 minutes. I think the effect of the demon in the very first 5 minutes was great, and then they ruined it. But
Yeah.
yeah, the first 5 minutes of that movie are great.
Well, I think we have came to a natural end to the discussion on Count Magnus, and I suppose it is time to round up the podcast with our tradition of giving it a score. Take it away, gentlemen. Tell everyone, what do you think this short story deserves? 100 out of 10 from Robert.
No, I'll just give it 10 out of 10, and I'll give all of his stories 10 out of 10, for that matter.
I guess we don't need to review any other stories by R.James. Well, now that we know all of these scores. Okay. I'll give it a... Fuck. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Yeah. I can't give it anymore. I think I'm already giving it too much, if I'm honest.
Anthony.
Huh. I mean, if I was a little kid, I would maybe give it like an 8 out of 10. But being a jaded horror reading adult in the modern age, it's nothing more to me, I guess, than a sort of a quaint curiosity. Which, by the way, I heard that BBC back in the year 2000, I think, got Christopher Lee to read some M.R. James stories by firelight, which probably would magnify the appeal of all of his stories greatly. Christopher Lee could do no wrong in terms of that. So I actually want to go back and see if I can find some of those videos. But failing that as an adult, I think I'm going to give it 5 out of 10. All apologies to Robert. Well written story, just it didn't hit me in the horror feels. It got me more like Christmas time story quaintness. That I would love to hear Christopher Lee reading by firelight or whatever, or see that, but otherwise not very horror-y at all to my modern sensibilities. So or scary.
I will say if every copy of Count Magnus came with Christopher Lee narrating it, I would give it a 10 out of 10. But that's not the case.
Absolutely. I think so here too.
But
Same here.
that would be Christopher. Would that be a score for Christopher Lee, or would that be a score for M.R. James?
More for him. More for Christopher Lee.
I mean, the thing is that Christopher Lee has this authenticity that I feel like he could be reading you the list of groceries you got last week, and it'd still be, there'd be some pizzazz in it. He'd be like, three
Yes, it would have
carrots,
gravitas,
7
right?
potatoes.
Yeah.
He and under the right lighting conditions, it would sound very threatening too.
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
he'd look up from the groceries and he'd be like, and a touch of mustard. Like,
You'd be like, oh, what? What?
mustard? Insane. What else is on this grocery list, Christopher Lee?
Yeah.
What about you, actually? How much do you give
I'm gonna give
the
it-
grocery list?
I was gonna give it a 5, but I will give it a 6.5 instead, because if I happen to be right about this being the precursor story to casting the runes. Yeah. I mean, I think I can be generous on that count, because he's still working on something, and the evolution of that proved to have given fruit from this earlier attempt. So yeah, I think 6.5. All right, well, I guess that's the end of Count Magnus, everybody. And if our dear listeners agree or disagree with our takes on it, please leave a comment below. Like and subscribe if you like our content. Help us grow the channel. And if there are stories that you love that you want to share with us, please feel free to tell us. And until the next time, take care.